This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago when I graduated high school. I had grown up with my grandparents but decided to move to a different, and much larger, city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I somewhat knew the city already because I spent my summers with him, but this would be the first time I would have the freedom of an adult. To come and go as I pleased, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes whenever I wanted. I was excited, though sad to leave all my friends. As soon as I was settled in, my dad and stepmom sat me down to discuss the few rules and what I needed to know about the complex. Basic things like go wherever you want, but let us know when you leave / when you're coming back. Even if it's 2 a.m. Oh, and you'll have to park on the street because the apartment complex has limited parking. One more thing. There's the neighborhood creep. This guy, George, was well known to all the women in the complex as well as the police that patrolled the area. He was tall and fairly huge, very intimidating looking. My parents were pretty certain that he would leave me alone for one reason, my dad. Though George had a habit of stalking other women in the complex, he would stop and find a new target if they had a man make a show of being in their place. A brother, a lover, or a father. It didn't matter what he was to the woman or what he looked like. George would back off immediately. Since I lived with my dad, who is also quite tall and rather big-read, intimidating, I felt also confident that I would be alright. And I was. For a time. It started about 6 months after I moved in. My stepmom and dad were fighting a lot more until she got up and left him. One night I was sitting on my porch having a cigarette and browsing Facebook or whatever. I wish I could say that I felt like I was being watched, but I probably just looked up because I felt a bug or something. George was standing about 15 feet away, a little bit behind a tree, staring intently at me. I nearly dropped my cigarette. Shakily, I stubbed it out and went inside. I was home alone, so I made sure to lock all my doors and then played a video game in my room. I told myself that I was probably just paranoid. The next morning I got up for my morning cigarette and coffee. Lo and behold, minutes after I got onto my porch, George came ambling out of his apartment to look my way. I sucked down my cigarette and went back inside. This pattern continued for a couple weeks. It was like George stood at his sliding glass door peeking out, waiting to see when I would pop out. I told my dad about it, and he tried to sit with me whenever I went to smoke. If he came with me, George wouldn't even peep a head out of his door. Of course, the other women in the complex have already tried to call police about George. But he lives in the complex and staring isn't a crime, so there wasn't much they could do. I didn't know how far George had taken it with other women before. With that info in my mind, I knew calling wouldn't be much use. Things slowly escalated. Once my stepmom left, I had access to her parking spot. So I had 3 ways to get from my car to my apartment depending on how I parked. One of the ways went just past George's apartment, about 5 feet from his door. Since I got off work late most nights, I avoided that route as much as possible. Slowly but surely, like he memorized my schedule, he would be on one of the paths when I was coming home. Not directly on the concrete, but a few feet away on the grass. Behind a tree. It was like he thought I couldn't see him. Picture a child hiding very terribly behind a tree. You can see 90% of their body and you know that they are there. That's how he would do it. I would rush past him, avoid eye contact, but prepare to scream if I heard him come after me. I started to carry my keys between my fingertips. I bought a pocket knife and I would walk from my car with it halfway open already, even though I've never been in any kind of fight in my life. Around this time I believe my mom was trying to find me free self-defense classes, since I couldn't afford anything on my tight budget. My dad was steadily getting more and more pissed off as George edged closer and closer to escalating as the days went by. It went from November to May. If my dad wasn't home, I would lock my bedroom door and keep my knife under my pillow. I would Skype all night with my boyfriend, just so someone could call 911 for me if need be. I put a bunch of flower pots in front of my bedroom window so no one could get in silently, lol. I started sitting on the floor of my porch below the wall out of sight to smoke, but angled so I could see him if he walked up to it. Nightmares of being kidnapped or raped or murdered started to invade my sleep every night. Then one day my neighbor, Shell, was gossiping to me. "Did you hear about George?" "No. He got arrested last night. In the complex parking lot there's a big sort of electrical power box. It stands about waist height, and is perhaps 2 or 3 feet wide. About 10 minutes before I was supposed to come home and park right in front of it, some lady with her kid walking by and saw George sitting on the box masturbating. Was he waiting there for me? Jerking off to the thought of me seeing him. Ugh, the thought makes me want to puke and scares me all at the same time. I was relieved for a few days of my stress. But it was only a few days that he was gone. Then he was back, and he went right back to the same OL routine. One night he got far braver. It was maybe 7 p.m. when I went out for a cigarette with my dad. A neighbor walked up to chat with my dad, and George came outside and stood out in the open, staring me down. "Dude's asking to get his fucking ass kicked," my dad said under his breath. Then he chatted to the neighbor some more. I rolled my eyes, went inside, and played some more video games. I was healing in a World of Warcraft dungeon when I heard Shell shouting, "Where are you?" But I was healing, a pretty important job, and I figured she was talking to someone else. Until she burst into my room in a panic, her eyes huge. She hopped from foot to foot frantically like she was doing the potty dance. "He's bleeding." "Who?" I asked in bewilderment. "Your dad. Come quick." I made some teenager huffing sound and left my computer, certainly pissing off the rest of the group. I grabbed our little first aid kit filled with band-aids. I thought in my mind that my dad was doing something stupid like tossing up his pocket knife and trying to catch it. But when I stepped outside I found myself face to face with a real horror. About 6 people surrounded my dad, including Shell, and my neighbor Caleb held a shirt to my dad's side. He was facing away from me, and his entire back was just covered in blood. It looked like he had been mauled by a bear. That was seriously my first thought. I didn't know we had bears in the city. Caleb's hold on the shirt slipped, and blood sprayed. I feel queasy writing this down. I have never in my life been the person people turn to in an emergency. Blood makes me lightheaded and I have anxiety attacks over not being able to find a specific bookmark. But all of the adults, people around 30 to 40, while I was just 18, around me were panicked aside from Caleb. I needed to be the person that people turned to. I threw the first aid kit onto the porch and told Shell where we keep our towels. She rushed to go grab one. "Has anyone called 911? I shouted. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at me like they'd never heard of 911 before. "No." My dad said. "I can't afford an ambulance." "Shut up." I said. "What happened?" "That fucker stabbed me." So I dialed 911, and relayed our address and reason for emergency. Operator told us to keep applying pressure to the wound on my father's lower back. My dad is a true champ. Even though the sidewalk was just one big puddle of blood gross, he stayed on his feet until someone thought to run and get him a chair. I ran back and forth along the walkways to get the police and show them the house that George lived in. And then I ran back and forth to get the paramedics. They were so cold and so agonizingly slow. They walked calmly and I wanted to scream at them to run. My dad could be bleeding out. Don't you care? I learned later that they don't run because if they let adrenaline kick in, mistakes can happen. They shoved Caleb out of the way because he refused to let go of my dad's wound and got him packed into the ambulance. I was about to jump on when police stopped me and told me that I had to stay so I could give my statement. My dad shouted at me to call his boss, and I remembered all his allergies and whatnot for the paramedics. God, 2 years later and all these details have been burned into my brain. I gave my statement to the police. Then they made me sit outside the complex on the sidewalk for 2 to 3 hours. They kept me updated on my dad. Once I had called his boss, my boss, and answered my stepmom's message, that's when I allowed myself to break down. It felt like I cried for forever. One of the cops was nice enough to go into my house and grab my cigarettes and a bottle of water for me. He stayed with me the entire time to make sure I didn't run off or something, but he was very nice. He offered to let me sit in his cruiser a few times to get away from the cold. George was waiting in his apartment when they came. When they took him out to where I was, and there were 14 Colombian pesos cars. 14, he still kept trying to stare at me. I stared right back and felt such hatred that I have never in my life felt. I wanted to go over there and murder him. My babysitting cop looked over and saw that George was staring, so he used his flashlight to keep George from being able to look at me. Once it was all over, I was allowed to go back to my house where I waited for information about my dad. I gathered the story from my neighbors while he was in the hospital for 9 days. He had shouted at George to leave his daughter alone, and George had shouted back at him while I was in the house, totally unaware. George said something along the lines of "Come tell me that" to my face like a man. So my dad hopped over the porch and waltzed up to him. The creep had been waiting with a 12-inch blade held to the side of his leg. He struck out with his empty hand, and then got my dad in the back with the knife. It missed his kidney very, very narrowly. Traveled up and punctured his lung and damaged his diaphragm. My dad didn't realize he had been stabbed at first. He got George into a headlock and pummeled the shit out of him, thinking the dude had just punched him in the kidney. George dropped the knife, rolled in the grass, and picked up another knife he had been hiding and stabbed my dad again, this time in the upper back. This wound was much more shallow but still required stitches later. At this point, Shell came outside and screamed to my dad that he was bleeding. He took off his shirt, got pissed, and threw it at George. At that point, the neighborhood stalker put his hands up and went into his apartment. The blood stayed on the pavement until about noon the next day, when my neighbors kindly washed it off for me. I still have pictures in my email of it, as well as my dad's injuries. My dad spent more time in the hospital in critical condition than George spent being held in jail. I feel like it was my fault. I've been addressing that in therapy, but I still feel awful about it all, like my dad had to fight my own battle for me. Throughout the week while I was on my porch or just outside, I had so many women come up to me. They all told me to thank my dad for them. They had all been terrorized by George at some point, and now they were certain he would be away for good. Several poor women had had George stalk them up to their apartment door and pull his pants down, demanding sex. I can't believe the cops couldn't do anything. One of those days one of my neighbors came up to me to tell me that the police, and neighbors, had searched the complex and found that George had stashed many knives all over the place. Buried in gardens, stuck behind trees, under his doormat. I shudder to think that he might have planned to one day grab one of his targets and do something far more sinister than stare. George was declared guilty for battery with a deadly weapon, but the attempted murder charge was dropped. He was out of prison by Christmas on good behavior or whatever, but my dad and I have a lifelong restraining order against him. He has never tried to come after me, so I can only hope that he's terrified of my dad. I wish I could tell you guys that I took self-defense classes and learned to fight the way my dad can, but I'm still a pussy who can't even slap a spider, so there's that. My dad is doing all right now. He's just had his third surgery on Tuesday trying to repair the damage done to him internally. We're hoping that this will be his last, and his quality of life will vastly improve. I probably owe my life to my dad. If he hadn't fought George for me, maybe I would have been the first victim George stabbed. I apologize for any spelling or grammatical mistakes. I reread it over once to check, but I'm not perfect. George. Let's not meet again. Today, I found out from my own mother that her ex-boyfriend, the man I lived with from age 11 to 20, secretly videotaped my younger sister and myself in our own bedrooms, taking showers/baths, and even going so far as to sit on the roof and watch us through the skylight in our bathroom. I am a 22-year-old female, my sister is 3 years younger. My mom left him when I was 20, around the same time I moved in with my boyfriend. The reason I moved in with my boyfriend was because my mom's boyfriend, Greg, had started to make me more and more uncomfortable. Now, Greg and I, since I was 11 and met him, had always gotten along fairly well. My mom went through a slew of boyfriends after divorcing my father when I was 4. By 11, I had already been to 3 different elementary schools and lived in 4 different houses from living with my mom's boyfriends and it not working out. I was used to it. I was a quiet girl who liked to read and kept to herself, so I was always polite enough, knowing at some point or another either him or my mom would go off the deep end and I'd never see him again. My little sister hated Greg from the first day. Absolutely would not tolerate him. For the 9 years he was in our life, they'd have screaming matches almost every day. We should have listened to her innocent 8-year-old instincts, I suppose. But as I said, Greg and I got on fairly well, although he always did make me a little uncomfortable, just from certain instances here and there happening. When we first moved in with him, within a week he coincidentally lost his job. It took over a year before he got another one. My mom supported him for a year. Yet he was always giving her crap if her, my sister and myself had a shopping day or she gave me money when I went with friends. One time he accidentally walked in on me when I was about 13 changing out of my bikini after we all got home from the lake. Another time, I was 14, I awoke to him in me and my sister's bedroom on Christmas Eve in the middle of the night, just staring at us. I confronted him the next day and he chalked it up to saying he wanted to make sure we were asleep before Santa came. My little sis and I stopped believing in Santa years before, thanks to the older kids on the school bus, LOL. When I was 16 and had my first real boyfriend, Greg would absolutely terrorize him to the point he refused to come over my house. Now, my real father is a cool cat who unfortunately had to deal with my mother in order to see us. She's selfish and crazy and played up the whole I deserve my little girls over a man raising them blah blah, but my father would shake hands with the boys I dated, if they had a chance to meet, and treat them with respect unless given a real reason to dislike them. Greg would belittle them, get in their face, treat them all like they were asshole punks. I ended up dating the same guy for the last 3 years of high school and Greg never once had anything nice to say about him. My boyfriend at the time thought it was because he was taller than Greg. I think the most memorable and prominent memory that really made me so uncomfortable I moved in with my boyfriend was Greg opening up to me. I was 19, just moved back home from a college out of state after 1 semester, was that my mom hadn't F***ed him in a year. Then moving closer to me when we were smoking a joint on the sun porch. There are a few more instances that happened, but basically, I lived with this guy for 9 years of my life. Through the hardest years yet of my life, puberty, discovering my own body, dealing with the fact at 12 I was already a C-cup with a size 0 waist, learning to love my body and be comfortable with dealing with the horny boys my age always trying to mess with my head and heart just to be able to have a story in the locker room. Never mind discovering a supposed father figure in my life was secretly watching me in intimate places I thought I had 100% privacy from the entire world in. I haven't lived with him in 2 years, but I honestly feel so violated and am still trying to cope with this bomb that has been dropped on the final years of my childhood. My little sister doesn't know and I hope she never finds out. I'm furious my mom didn't do anything about it, other than leave him when she discovered the videos and files on his iPad. She initially told us she left because she kept catching him on teen pornography websites. That makes me wonder if he sold any of his videos of us to other pedophiles or uploaded them anywhere. I shudder at the thought. I guess he's involved in a pretty serious sexual harassment case at his work currently. He has a grown daughter of his own that seems to worship him. My friends have seen him out downtown at the bars with girls who are clearly old enough to drink but resemble 16-year-olds. I'm honestly just so confused and hurt and feel so violated. Apologies if this isn't the appropriate sub. I'm only on Reddit for LNM and didn't want to post to any sexual abuse Reddit because I was never actually touched and some people have gone through actual hell. I'm fortunate enough to have been protected from the truth until I was 22 and in a stable place in my life that it most likely won't traumatize me for the rest of my life, or so I hope. I honestly am just so shocked. I feel like I'm just rambling now cause I legit just do not know how to feel about this. So many mixed emotions. So Greg, let's never meet again you pedo. I had a coworker turn really creepy on me. What really sucks about it is that he seemed like a halfway decent guy before he got into the alcohol. I'm pretty sure he got depressed. We were all working in a toxic environment and to some extent, we all had problems because of it. Or, if we went into that job with mental or physical illnesses, the work environment exacerbated them. It was that kind of workplace. I should have quit years before I did. But live and learn. As I was saying, he got into alcohol pretty bad somewhere down the line and would always complain of sleep issues. He ended up doing something really dumb. He combined his sleep meds with alcohol, something I warned him not to do because people often sleepwalk on that drug, and ended up wrapping his car around a tree. He's lucky to be alive. Real lucky to be alive. And because he was one of the kinder people I worked with and didn't make me feel like I was automatically a shit, lazy worker because of an illness I couldn't control, I wanted to pay the kindness forward. He was down to getting to and from work on a bike. I helped him out by driving him home on the mornings when I could. Graveyard shift is a bitch enough without having to ride a bike home in the rain. But he still continued to drink. And later I learned get into other crap. Sometimes he'd get these really manic episodes and do really dumb shit like drag us to the parking lot to look at his new vehicle when we were not supposed to leave the shop. And one evening I got up and walked away from him because he continued to give me too much information about his sex life. He claimed he didn't know he was upsetting me even though I was saying repeatedly, "Creeper coworker, stop. Creeper coworker, stop. Creeper coworker fucking stop." He apologized profusely for that and was acting sincerely confused, considering he was either drunk or high. There's a good chance he didn't catch my protests, but it's still no excuse to lay out the details on his intercourse with an ex in such gory, graphic highlights that it turned my already fragile stomach. What really put the strain on the friendship and the final nail in the coffin were the drunken phone calls. I don't like being around drunk people, unless I'm also drunk, at the best of times. I certainly don't like being rambled at about what to do with my life by someone who is fucking up their own, and for some reason, this was a pastime of his. That and layering on the compliments to an almost absurd capacity while alternately hinting that I don't have self-confidence. This was ironic considering how codependent he was. He moved to the state I'm in and left a life he seemed really happy with behind to follow a girl that would ultimately break up with him. When he couldn't get with another coworker I was friends with because he creeped her out for coming on too strong, he turned to me. He finally confessed that he liked me more as a friend, to which I politely but firmly turned him down. He was at least 10 years my senior and he was making some really bad choices. I liked and trusted him when I first met him, and to me, that's the really creepy element of this tale, what drugs and alcohol can do to a person. I got out the bad work environment and back into one just as shitty, sadly. Must be the water in this area. But my health improved, nonetheless. I found a good doctor and got to the root cause of many of my issues. Anxiety being a big factor. I even went to counseling because I was determined not to let it ruin me. I saw him one time during this period when he was living with some new girl. I congratulated him on also escaping the hellhole we had both come from and had a pretty amiable conversation with him. He seemed to be doing better. 2 days later he called me drunk and starting the same shit. I ended the call from him and deleted his number. I was working through my own shit at the time and was not about to get sucked back into his. He left me a message apologizing. I never responded. Present day. I came to the conclusion that the source of a lot my depression and unhappiness was due to the fact that I simply hate where I live. There's nothing here. No opportunities, and it's like living in a vacuum. No matter what you do, you're stuck. Plus, I needed to spread my wings and take some risks. I had tried living the cookie-cutter life that people expected on me, and it had almost killed me. I managed to get a job elsewhere, and in a huge stroke of fortune managed to keep one of my current jobs because it is nationwide. I am finally getting out. Then about a night or two ago, guess who calls me? Creeper coworker. I should not have answered at all. I didn't recognize the number and it was late. But I was awake and curious. In hindsight, I should have told him he had the wrong number and hung up. Damn my soft heart. He asked how I was doing, but in truth, he was not really interested. He rattled on about how he had been through rehab for drugs and alcohol. I knew about the drinking but not the drugs. Now a lot of his manic behavior makes sense. Anyway, one of the first things he says is, I got my own place. I'm not with a girl anymore. It just seemed like such an awkward and random statement that I didn't know what to say. I was empathetic but cautious. He didn't drop that statement for no reason. I expressed my happiness for him and that he was getting better and getting help. He began to gush on about how his therapist had told him to keep connections with the positive people in his life, and that I was one of the people in his life that he had believed to be truly good and beautiful and smart. He went on a little longer than I liked about how attractive I looked that day he had seen me at my new job for longer than I was comfortable with, but he didn't say anything inappropriate, so I just continued to listen with a cautious ear. He talked about moving back to his home state, and I will say I was genuinely pleased and happy on his behalf. I'm happy for anyone who can get out of this rut of a county. Which led me to tell him of my new employment opportunity and how glad I was we were both doing so well for ourselves considering where we had been. That's where it went downhill. I can't say what went first, chicken or egg, but that did not make him happy. He got pretty flustered and agitated. You don't need to go to insert place to be happy. Listen, come back to state with me. You'd love it there. I kind of just went silent and I pulled the phone away from my mouth in case I started nervous laughter. What? I kind of laughed it off and reiterated that I have not even started or been through orientation for my new employment. I'm trying to build a better life for myself. I can't go on a vacation out of state. I haven't even been able to visit my best friend in Canada. I'm not going up north with some random former co-worker that's still obviously creeping on me. I didn't tell him that last part, but what he said next pretty much confirms it. I'm not saying be my girlfriend, just come see the mountains. I'm telling you, you won't want to leave. I'm not going to try to have sex with you or anything. I never said anything about sex or being his girlfriend. He repeated that a couple of times in the conversation. Plus, I read this wonderful book called The Gift of Fear a while back, and I encourage every man and woman to read it. Especially women. The harder someone is trying to convince you they are not up to anything nefarious, the more likely they are. Why is this guy calling me randomly to tell me that he had a new house, has no girlfriend, yet he's moving after getting a new house, but he's trying to convince me very hard to jeopardize my future and just leave the state with him on a whim. For something platonic? My conclusion, this guy is a liar and he's nuts. He layered on so strong at the beginning of the conversation how pretty I am, how I'm such an awesome, intelligent woman, and then he drops that bomb. This is someone who doesn't want to screw me, remember? Someone who just wants to be my friend. I don't remember what I said, but it was basically something like, no, dude. I have plans. I worked my ass off to get the opportunity I've gotten, and I'm not going to just get on a plane with you. From there he just crossed the line even further. Said I was making a mistake, missing an opportunity he was not offering anyone else. WTF? And do what when I get out of state if not be his GF? I have no job, no friends, no contacts out there, how I was missing out on life, etc. I told him something like it's been nice chatting, I'm going now. I didn't let him answer. I hung up. I blocked his number. I think this story may have been more bizarre than creepy, but it is a real story. Needless to say, I have not been regretting my choice to block him. Let's never meet again, ex-co-worker.